History does not preserve itself. It needs people who understand that a yellowed sheet of paper in a dusty box may carry the soul of a nation and are willing to protect it, even when no one believes them. My daughter-in-law threw 7 of my file boxes onto the sidewalk on the morning of Saturday, April 11th, 2023, while I was at the American Archivists Association conference in Boston, 4 hours from Philadelphia by car, completely unaware. The first call came from Mrs. Dorothy Chen, my 78-year-old neighbor on Spruce Street, who had lived next door to me for 21 years and knew that green boxes with red labels were never to be left outside. "Adele," she said, her voice low, like someone trying to explain the unexplainable. "There are 7 of your boxes on the sidewalk. The garbage truck comes at 10. I was sitting in a conference hall at 8:30 in the morning, listening to an archivist from the Library of Congress speak about digitizing 18th century documents. My phone vibrated. Seeing Dorothy's name, I excused myself from the person beside me and stepped outside. After hanging up with Dorothy, I called my daughter-in-law, Jennifer, Marcus's wife, who had moved into my house with my son 6 months earlier, after selling their apartment in Trenton to save money for a new home. The phone rang 3 times. 4, 5. Jennifer did not answer. I called Marcus. He picked up after the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Mom, what's wrong?" "My green boxes," I said, keeping my voice steady because 66 years of living had taught me that panic solves nothing, "are on the sidewalk. And the garbage truck comes at 10. Marcus, I need you to bring them inside right now." "Oh." I heard him sit up. "Jennifer said those boxes were just old papers you didn't need anymore, taking up space." "Marcus." My voice shifted in the way I rarely used, but he recognized immediately. The tone of someone speaking about something important, with no time to explain why. "Bring those boxes inside right now, all 7 of them. Do not open them. Do not move them anywhere else. Just bring them inside. I'll explain later." There was a pause. Then, "Okay, Mom." I stood in the hallway of a Boston hotel with my phone in my hand, and for the first time in many years, allowed my hands to tremble slightly, not from fear, but because I understood that inside those 7 green boxes, the ones Jennifer called old useless papers and clutter, were things that if carried away by a garbage truck, I would never forgive myself for losing, not because they belong to me, but because they belong to American history, and I was the only one who knew it. My name is Adele Margaret Whitmore, born September 22, 1957, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, daughter of a history professor and a librarian, raised in a row house in West Philadelphia, with bookshelves that reached the ceiling, and the scent of old paper and ink always present like a 5th member of the family. My father, Professor Edward Whitmore, taught American history at the University of Pennsylvania, and had the habit, every evening after dinner, of bringing my brother James and me into his study to tell us about the people who built this country, not from textbooks, but from original documents he had read through years of research. He used to say, "Adele, history is not what people write about the past. History is what people in the past wrote about themselves. And that is why primary sources matter more than any book." I learned that message the way children learn the most important things, not by trying to memorize it, but by living with it long enough that it became part of how I saw the world. I studied history and library science at Penn, graduated in 1979, and began working at the Philadelphia Museum of Art as a junior archivist. In 1985, I moved to the Library Company of Philadelphia, one of the oldest libraries in America, founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731, and remained there for 12 years. In 1997, I accepted the position of head of special collections at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, where I worked until retiring in 2021. 38 years. While millions of pages passed through my hands, letters, diaries, manuscripts, maps, meeting minutes, wills, contracts, and small scraps of paper bearing the handwriting of those who shaped history. I handled the papers of presidents, Supreme Court justices, revolutionaries, entrepreneurs, poets, physicians, and ordinary people whose names are forgotten, but whose lives are part of the larger story. 38 years as an archivist taught me many things about history, but more importantly, it taught me about people, specifically the difference between someone who understands the value of something and someone who only sees its surface. Jennifer, my daughter-in-law, saw 7 green boxes filled with old paper. What I saw in those boxes was something entirely different. But to understand why I was standing in a Boston hotel hallway with trembling hands and a faster-than-usual heartbeat, I need to tell you about Eleanor Hartwell and what she entrusted to me. Eleanor Grace Hartwell was born in 1892 and died in 1988 at the age of 96. She was the oldest resident in her apartment building in Rittenhouse Square, and as I later came to understand, had deeper family ties to Philadelphia's history than anyone I had ever met. I met Eleanor in 1985 when I had just begun working at the Library Company of Philadelphia and was assigned to interview elderly community members about their memories of early 20th century Philadelphia for an oral history archive project. Eleanor was one of the people referred to me. I arrived with a small tape recorder and a notebook, prepared for a standard interview. What happened over the next 3 hours was anything but standard. Eleanor was a remarkable storyteller, not in a romanticized or exaggerated sense, but in the precise and detailed way of someone who had observed life with a scientist's attention. She described Philadelphia in the 1920s and 30s in a way no history book I had read ever could. The sounds and smells and textures of daily life, the people she knew, the events she witnessed. At the end of that first interview, Eleanor looked at me with the eyes of someone making an assessment and said, "Adele, you're the first person who has come here and truly listened. Not polite listening, real listening." She paused. "You work with historical documents, don't you?" "Yes," I said. "You understand the value of things other people think are unimportant?" "That's my job," I replied. Eleanor nodded. Then she stood, slowly, and with the carefulness of advanced age, and went into her bedroom. She returned with a small wooden box, about 10 inches square, secured with an old brass latch. "I want you to keep this," she said. "I can't accept," I began. "Not a gift," Eleanor interrupted. "Keep it for me until I tell you that you may open it, or until I die. If I die before telling you, you decide." I looked at the box. "What's inside?" Things my family has kept for a very long time, Eleanor said, and things I believe deserve better preservation than sitting in the closet of a 93-year-old woman. She smiled faintly. But I'm not ready for them to go to a museum or library. Not yet. You are the person I trust. I brought the box home and placed it in the locked filing cabinet in my home office. I did not open it. Eleanor died in 1988, 3 years after that meeting. I attended her funeral. Afterward, her attorney contacted me. Eleanor had left a note in her will. The wooden box entrusted to Adele Whitmore is her legal property, to be used at her professional discretion. I went home, took the box out, and for the first time in 3 years, opened it, and I sank down onto the floor of my study. Not because I meant to sit, but because my legs would no longer hold me. Inside Eleanor Hartwell's small wooden box were 27 letters, wrapped in tissue paper and tied into 3 bundles with ribbon that had faded pale with age. Alongside them was a handwritten note from Eleanor and a slim brown leather-bound journal. I picked up the first letter and looked at the recipient's address. The handwriting was small and precise. The iron gall ink browned with time, but still entirely legible. Then I looked at the signature. I set the letter down, picked up the second, set it down, picked up the third. After about 5 minutes, I cannot be certain how long, because I was not counting, I sank to the floor. Among the 27 letters, I counted. 9 signed by Benjamin Franklin, 6 signed by Thomas Jefferson, 4 signed by John Adams, 3 signed by Alexander Hamilton, and the remaining 5 by other founding fathers, including James Madison and George Mason. I had worked with historical documents for 38 years. I had held in my hands the papers of the most significant figures in American history. I understood that materials like this existed, housed in libraries, museums, and private collections across the country. But not like this. Not in a small wooden box in the apartment of a 96-year-old woman in Rittenhouse Square, wrapped in tissue and tied with ribbon. I read Eleanor's note. In the steady handwriting of someone trained in penmanship a century earlier, she explained that her family was distantly related to the prominent Hartwell family of Philadelphia, merchants and bankers during the Revolutionary era, who maintained both business and personal relationships with many of the founding fathers. The letters had been passed down through generations, regarded merely as old things from great-grandfather's time. Several times the family had nearly thrown them away while moving house, and Eleanor, the only one in her generation who understood enough history to recognize what they were, had preserved them. I have no children, Eleanor wrote, and no grandchildren who care enough to understand. I have considered bringing them to a museum many times, but did not want them swallowed into storage, where no one would ever see them again. I want someone who can use them properly, not merely store them, but tell their story. Adele Whitmore is the person I trust to do that. The slim journal belonged to an ancestor named Eliza Hartwell. It recorded events during the Revolutionary period in Philadelphia, including social gatherings attended by the Founding Fathers. It provided context for many of the letters. I sat in my study until nearly midnight, reading and rereading each letter, verifying signatures against the memory I carried from decades of handling collections, and eventually reaching my first conclusion. These were not forgeries. The handwriting, ink, paper, linguistic style, all consistent with the period. I was not the final authority on authentication, but I had handled enough 18th century primary sources to recognize the difference between genuine and false. My second conclusion: the letters required formal professional authentication, and I needed to find a way to do so properly. My third conclusion came later, after I had closed the box and sat quietly in the darkened room. Eleanor had trusted me. She had not given these to a museum or a library. She had given them to me, and the question of what it meant to use them properly was one I would have to answer by the way I lived. I placed the box in the fireproof cabinet in my study and began to plan. In the 30 years between opening the box in 1988 and the morning Jennifer placed the file boxes on the sidewalk in 2023, I did the following with Eleanor's 27 letters. First, I had them discreetly authenticated by 3 independent experts, an 18th century paper and ink specialist from New York, a Harvard historian specializing in the handwriting of the Founding Fathers, and a historical document appraiser from the Smithsonian Institution. Each was consulted separately, unaware of the others, and none was informed of the complete provenance. All 3 confirmed: authentic, not forgeries, not copies, original late 18th century letters. Second, I conducted research into the Hartwell family history, verifying Eleanor's connection to the individuals mentioned in Eliza Hartwell's journal. In the archives of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, I located documentation confirming that the Hartwells had indeed been prominent Philadelphia merchants during the Revolutionary period and maintained business relationships with multiple historical figures. Third, I preserved the letters according to the highest archival standards, each placed in an acid-free mylar sleeve, then in an acid-free folder, then stored in a climate-controlled archival box. I purchased a specialized storage cabinet specifically for their protection. Fourth, I prepared full documentation of the letters' provenance, the Hartwell lineage, their generational transfer, Eleanor's handwritten note and will, and the authentication findings of the 3 experts. Fifth, and this was the matter I postponed the longest, I did not decide what to do with them. Eleanor had said, use them properly. But what was proper? Donation to a museum? Sale to fund something worthwhile? A curated exhibition? A scholarly publication? For 30 years, I had no definitive answer. Not because I failed to consider it, but because each time I approached a decision, something held me back. Thomas, my husband, died in 2010, leaving the Spruce Street house to Marcus and me. Marcus built a life of his own, and I, in my retirement, continued to care for the letters and waited for something I could not quite name. Until the morning of April 11th, 2023, when Jennifer set the 7 boxes on the sidewalk. Those 7 boxes contained many things: professional records from 38 years in archival work, research files, notebooks, photographs. But in box number 4, inside a labeled archival container marked in red, "Fragile, do not move," were Eleanor Hartwell's letters. I had placed them there 3 months earlier while clearing part of my office for plumbing repairs, intending to return them to the secured cabinet once the work was complete. I did not. The repairs lasted longer than expected, and then I forgot. It was the only careless mistake I had made in 30 years, and it nearly became an irreversible disaster. Jennifer Lee Parker. Whitmore is intelligent, ambitious, and competent in her marketing career. I do not deny those qualities. I also do not deny that she loves Marcus, not in the way Thomas and I loved one another. But that is the observation of an outsider, and I lack the full knowledge required to judge. What I can speak about are the words and actions of the 6 months after she moved into my home. They moved in during October of 2022, after selling their apartment in Trenton. The plan, as Marcus explained, was to stay in the Spruce Street house temporarily, while saving enough money to purchase a new home. Perhaps a year, perhaps 18 months. I agreed. Not because I lacked alternatives, but because Marcus is my son, and I wished to help him. What I did not anticipate was that Jennifer's definition of temporary and mine were fundamentally different. In the first month, she began suggesting updates to the house, repainting walls, replacing carpets, removing outdated furniture I had collected over 40 years. I was polite but firm. This was my home, and I did not want it altered. She nodded and did not argue, but her expression told me the conversation was not finished. In the second month, Jennifer began speaking about space. My study, the largest room on the second floor, where my preservation cabinet and bookshelves stood, was, in her words, a wasted room since I was retired and no longer needed an office. She suggested converting it into a guest room or a gym. I declined. In the third month, the small remarks began. Adele, I don't understand why you need so many books. If you're not reading them, they should go. This house has too much stuff. People say that as you get older, you should live more simply. I heard those remarks and did not respond immediately. 38 years in archival work had taught me that not everything requires immediate reaction. Sometimes one observes first. In the fourth month, Jennifer began speaking about me to Marcus in a way that, living in the same house, I could not help but overhear. Your mother keeps too many useless things. She refuses to modernize. She needs to learn how to let go. Marcus, whom I raised and know well enough, did not defend me in those conversations. Not because he agreed with Jennifer, but because he chose silence, which in this case was its own kind of alignment. I took note. On not judgment, simply observation. In the 5th month, Jennifer suggested I consider moving into a senior living community in Chestnut Hill. Nice amenities, staff support, you'd have friends your own age. I was 66, entirely healthy, and managing my life more effectively than many people I knew. I said no, less politely than before. The 6th month was April of 2023. The month Jennifer carried my file boxes down the stairs and set them on the sidewalk on a Saturday morning she knew I was in Boston. She did not do it accidentally. No one carries 7 boxes downstairs and places them at the curb by accident. It was a decision made by someone who wanted space and no longer cared to explain or ask permission. A house is not a storage dump. That was not something she said after being confronted. It was what Marcus later told me she had said beforehand, her justification offered before I called, before anyone noticed. A house is not a storage dump. In 38 years of working with historical records, I have seen important things lost because people did not recognize what they were. but I had never experienced that loss inside my own home, with my own possessions, at the hands of someone living under my roof, until April 11th, 2023. I canceled my registration for the afternoon session of the Boston conference and booked the earliest train back to Philadelphia, the 10:30 a.m. Amtrak, arriving at 1 in the afternoon. For 4 hours on that train, I sat still and did nothing. No reading, no phone, no conversation. I looked out the window and thought. Not about Jennifer or Marcus, not about what I would say or do once I got home. I thought about Eleanor Hartwell. Eleanor had trusted me 30 years earlier. She placed into my hands what she had preserved her entire life and said, "Adele is the person I trust." For 30 years, I had honored that trust, careful preservation, thorough research, patient waiting for the right moment. And then, because of a single careless oversight, placing them in a box instead of the secure cabinet, I had nearly allowed history to be thrown into a garbage truck. That could never happen again. When the train pulled into Philadelphia, Marcus met me at the station and drove home in near silence. Before we went inside, he said, "Mom, everything's inside. I brought it all in. Jennifer, you don't need to say anything about Jennifer right now," I said. "I need to go in and check the boxes." The 7 boxes sat in the living room, stacked in the same order Marcus had carried them in. I inspected each one, not hurriedly, but the way an archivist inspects materials, carefully, systematically, noting every detail. 6 of the 7, work files, notebooks, photographs, research papers, all intact. The box number 4, the specialized archival container still sealed, unopened, undamaged. I opened it. 27 letters, inside Mylar sleeves, inside acid-free folders, perfectly intact. I closed the box, carried it upstairs to my study, placed it inside the fireproof cabinet, and locked it. Then I sat at my desk and, for the first time since that morning, breathed. Jennifer stood in the doorway while I was seated there. "Adele, I just wanted to." "Jennifer," I said, my voice calm, in the way that 38 years of work demanding precision had shaped it. "You placed my belongings on the sidewalk while I was out of town. This is my house, and those are my possessions. I do not wish to discuss this today because I am not prepared to discuss it properly, but we will discuss it." She looked at me for a moment, and then she turned and walked away. I looked back at the locked cabinet, and for the first time in 30 years, I made a clear decision about Eleanor's letters. It was time. In the 2 weeks following April 11th, I did 3 things simultaneously, calmly and methodically, exactly as 38 years in the profession had taught me to approach complex matters. First, I called Dr. James Hartley at Penn, one of the country's leading scholars on 18th century American documents, and someone I had collaborated with on multiple research projects. I did not tell him about the letters over the phone. I simply asked whether he could meet privately regarding an important archival matter. He agreed to see me the following day. At that meeting, I brought high-resolution digital photographs of 3 of the 27 letters. Not the originals, only images. Dr. Hartley studied them for nearly 20 minutes without speaking. Then he lowered his laptop and looked at me. "Adele," he said, "if what I'm seeing is genuine, and I have reason to believe it is, based on preliminary analysis, This is the most significant discovery in American historical manuscript archives in at least 20 years, possibly longer. I know, I said. How long have you had them? 30 years. He looked at me silently for nearly 10 seconds. Then, why now? I told him about Jennifer and the boxes. Not everything, only enough to explain why I had decided to act. Adele, he said, you need an auction appraiser. Not necessarily to sell, but to determine precise market value. I can introduce you to the right person. I need more than that, I replied. I need counsel on how to handle this properly, not only financially, but historically and culturally. He nodded. Then we need a longer conversation. Second, on alongside that meeting, I called Margaret Chen, my family's estate attorney for many years, and asked her to review my will and all legal documents related to the Spruce Street house. I need to ensure, I told her, that everything in my home, everything, has clear and documented ownership. Margaret, who had known my family long enough to understand when not to ask questions, said, I'll review everything this week. Third, I said nothing to Marcus or Jennifer about what I was doing, not out of secrecy, but because 38 years in archives had taught me that important matters should not be discussed before you have enough information to discuss them properly. This is the archivist's golden rule. Before speaking of value, know the value. Before speaking of plans, have a plan. In those 2 weeks, Doctor. Hartley and I met 4 times. He introduced me to Elizabeth Morrison, head of books and manuscripts at Christie's Philadelphia, a woman who had appraised comparable collections for more than 2 decades. Our meeting took place on April 25th in my study. I placed the archival container on the desk and opened it. Elizabeth Morrison, whose professional reputation I had known for years, whose demeanor suggested someone who had seen too much to display easy astonishment, looked into the box and said nothing for 5 full minutes. Then she said, Adele, I need to bring a colleague to see this. He specializes in the handwriting of the Founding Fathers. How soon? I asked. Next week, if possible. Fine, I said. The full appraisal took place on May 3rd, 2023, 3 weeks after the sidewalk incident, in my study with Elizabeth Morrison and her colleague, Dr. William Park, a Revolutionary-era manuscript specialist from the Library of Congress. They worked for 4 hours. I sat quietly in the corner of the room, observing but not interfering. Marcus and Jennifer knew nothing of what was happening. I had simply said I had a professional meeting. Jennifer did not inquire further. Marcus asked whether I needed help. I told him no. When Dr. Park set down his magnifying lens after an hour and a half and looked toward Elizabeth Morrison, there was a brief moment, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, when I saw their faces and knew that what I had believed for 30 years was correct. After 4 hours, Elizabeth sat across from me. Adele, she said, I want to speak plainly because I believe you are someone who can hear the truth without having it softened. I have been an archivist for 38 years, I said. I can hear the truth. These 27 letters, she began, including 9 by Franklin, 6 by Jefferson, 4 by Adams, 3 by Hamilton, and 5 by other founding fathers, are all authentic. None are forgeries. None are copies. All are original 18th century manuscripts. I have known that for a long time, I replied. What you may not know, she continued, is the market value. Particularly in recent years, the market for original Founding Father manuscripts has surged. A single Franklin letter of routine content can now bring $70,000 to $100,000 at auction. And a Jefferson letter concerning major policy might bring $200,000 to $300,000. Hamilton, especially since the Broadway musical in 2015, has tripled in value. I listened without speaking. But more important than the individual letters, she said, is this collection as a whole. 27 letters from multiple founding fathers with complete and documented provenance, preserved properly for 30 years, accompanied by contextual journal material. She paused. Adele, this is not a group of isolated letters. It is a coherent collection with a narrative. In the current market, sold as a single unit, properly marketed at the right time, this collection could realize between $3 and $4 million. I sat quietly for about 15 seconds. Then I asked, and individually? Individually, the total could be higher, perhaps $4 to $5 million. But selling them separately would break the collection. Some buyers would be institutions, some private collectors, and the letters would be separated permanently. I do not want that, I said immediately. Elizabeth nodded. I suspected as much. Is there another option, I asked, beyond public auction? Elizabeth and Dr. Park exchanged a glance. A private sale to an institution, Dr. Park said. The Smithsonian Institution, the Library of Congress, or a major university. They would want something like this, and they would keep the collection intact. Would the price be lower? Possibly 20 to 30% lower than open auction, but the collection would remain whole. I looked out the study window, and the pear tree along the sidewalk was in bloom. Philadelphia spring, white and fleeting, and beautiful in the way that things which do not last often are. I need time to think, I said. Of course, Elizabeth replied. But Adele, whatever you decide, you should know that what you have done over the past 30 years, preserving, researching, documenting, has significantly increased this collection's value. A collection without clear provenance, without authentication, without proper preservation, would be worth far less. You have done everything right. I heard that and thought of Eleanor, of the note in the wooden box. Adele is the person I trust. I had not betrayed that trust. On the evening of May 3rd, after Elizabeth Morrison and Dr. Park had left, I knocked on Marcus and Jennifer's bedroom door and said I wanted to speak with Marcus alone. Jennifer looked at me with the expression of someone deciding whether to object, then stood and left without a word. Marcus sat across from me in the living room. He was 39, the only child Thomas and I had, the boy Thomas used to describe as having his mother's heart and his father's head. By that, Thomas meant Marcus was both sensitive and practical. I had always considered that a strength. Over the past 6 months, I had begun to understand that sometimes it could be a weakness. A man who is both sensitive and practical may choose the easiest path to keep the peace, rather than the right one. Mom, Marcus began, about what happened yesterday with Jennifer. I don't want to talk about Jennifer today, I interrupted gently. I want to tell you about the boxes, about what was inside them. He paused. What was inside? I told him about Eleanor Hartwell, about our meeting in 1985, the wooden box, 30 years of preservation. I told him about the 27 letters, the 3 separate authentications over the years, and the appraisal that had taken place that very afternoon. Marcus listened without interrupting. His expression shifted gradually, from polite readiness to hear about old papers to something I can only describe as recognition. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then, "And Jennifer put those boxes on the sidewalk." "One of the 7 boxes contained the letters," I said. We were fortunate the garbage truck had not yet arrived. Fortunate that Dorothy called. Fortunate that you brought them inside in time. He looked down at his hands. "Mom," he said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I replied. "You never knew because I never told you. That is my responsibility." He looked up. "Why didn't you?" "Because I had never decided what to do with them," I said honestly. "For 30 years I kept them, cared for them, studied them, but I did not act because I did not know what the right action was, and because I did not want to let them go." I paused. "The day Jennifer put those boxes on the sidewalk, and I say this not to blame her, only to explain, that was the day I understood I had waited too long, that waiting for the right time can sometimes mean never doing anything at all." Marcus was silent for a long time. Then, "What are you going to do now?" "I am deciding," I said, "but I want you to understand this first. The decision is mine, not yours, not Jennifer's, not anyone else's. Eleanor Hartwell entrusted them to me, and her will confirms that they belong to me. I will decide based on what I believe is right, not on what someone else wants me to do." "Mom," he said, his voice lower now, "I'm sorry for what's happened these past 6 months. Not just that day. Other things." I looked at my son. He is not perfect. No one is. But he is Thomas's son and mine, and sometimes love is enough to see past imperfection. "I know," I said. "We'll talk more later." It took me 2 weeks to make my decision, not because it was difficult, but because I wanted to be certain I was deciding for the right reasons, not out of the emotion of a single moment. During those weeks, I reread every letter in Eleanor's collection, reread Eliza Hartwell's journal, and sat quietly with the question of what Eleanor meant when she wrote, "Use them properly." Eleanor was not wealthy. She lived in a modest apartment until the end of her life. She had no children, no heirs invested in her family's legacy. She gave me the letters not to enrich me, but because she believed I would value and preserve them correctly. The question was, what did correctly mean to Eleanor? I could not ask her. She had been gone 35 years. But I could reread her note. "I do not want them swallowed into an archive where no one sees them. I want someone to use them properly, not just to store them, but to tell their story. Tell their story." That was the key. After 2 weeks, I met again with Elizabeth Morrison and told her my decision. I wished to sell the collection as a complete unit, but not at public auction. I wanted to negotiate directly with specific institutions, the Smithsonian Institution, the Library of Congress, and the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. My preference was to keep the collection in Philadelphia, in an institution accessible to the public. My conditions were clear. The collection must be publicly exhibited, not stored unseen. Eleanor Hartwell and the Hartwell family must receive formal acknowledgement in all documentation and exhibitions, and Eliza Hartwell's journal must remain permanently attached to the letters as an inseparable part of the collection. Elizabeth listened and nodded. "The American Philosophical Society will be deeply interested," she said. "It was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. Letters of Franklin preserved there would carry special historical resonance." "I know," I replied. "That is precisely why it is my first choice." The negotiations took approximately 6 weeks. After conducting their own independent authentication and review, the American Philosophical Society offered $2.8 million for the entire collection. The 27 letters, Eliza Hartwell's journal, and the 30 years of supporting research materials. I accepted, with one additional condition. A small gallery would be designated the Eleanor Hartwell Collection Room, with a plaque explaining the collection's history, from the Hartwell family of the Revolutionary era to Eleanor and then to me. They agreed. The transaction was finalized on July 15th, 2023. I stood in the temporary exhibition room at the Society's headquarters on Chestnut Street, a 15-minute walk from my house on Spruce, and looked at Eleanor's letters one last time before they assumed their new historical home. And I thought, "Eleanor, can you see this?" With the $2.8 million from Eleanor's collection, I did 3 things. First, I established the Eleanor Hartwell Historical Preservation Fund, a small nonprofit supporting archival and preservation projects for ordinary families in Philadelphia and the Delaware Valley. $200,000 formed its initial endowment. It was my way of honoring what Eleanor had done, not merely preserving something valuable, but ensuring that preservation continued beyond my lifetime. Second, I bought a house, not a condominium, not a row house, a 3-story Victorian in Cape May, built in 1892, with ocean-facing windows and a small garden in the back. The purchase price was $1.2 million, including basic furnishings. Cape May was where Thomas and I had spent many summers, mornings on the veranda with coffee, or afternoons reading by the sea. After Thomas died, I avoided it for 3 years. I could not bear the shape of his absence in a place where we had once been so happy. I return now, alone, but not lonely in the aching sense. Alone in the way of someone who has learned to sit with herself and find that sufficient. Third, I spoke with Marcus. I invited him to dinner, without Jennifer, at a small restaurant on Broad Street we had frequented since his university days, and I told him my plans. "I'm moving," I said, "not to assisted living. I bought a house in Cape May." "Cape May?" he repeated. "Your father and I loved it there," I said. "I want to go back. I want to spend my remaining years researching, writing, and overseeing the Eleanor Hartwell Fund." "Mom," he said. "You don't have to move because—" "I know I don't have to," I interrupted. "The Spruce Street house is mine. I could remain as long as I wish. I am choosing to leave because it is what I want, not because anyone wants me gone. That distinction matters." He was quiet. Then, "Will you leave the Spruce house to me?" "I will rent it to you at market rate for now," I said. "I am not ready to sell, but I will not give it away. I have learned in recent months that what people do not earn themselves, they do not always value properly." It was sharper than I intended, but it was true, and after the sidewalk incident, I had promised myself I would no longer sacrifice honesty for the comfort of others. Marcus nodded. "Marcus," I said more softly, because he is my son, and what I said next mattered. "I love you." I want our relationship to be better than it has been these past 6 months. But for that to happen, you must think carefully about what has occurred and what you want going forward. I cannot do that work for you." We remained in the restaurant another hour, speaking of ordinary things. His work, memories of Thomas, childhood summers in Cape May. When we parted on the sidewalk, he embraced me, not politely, but fully. "I love you, Mom," he said. "I love you too," I replied. For that moment, it was enough. I moved into the Cape May house on September 1st, 2023. It was not a grand relocation. I brought only what mattered: my books, a few paintings, the box of photographs of Thomas and our family, my grandmother's china set, and a small filing cabinet containing the most important of my research materials. The Cape May house came furnished by its previous owner. Not perfect, but sufficient and in keeping with the spirit of a seaside Victorian. I added only what was necessary and nothing more. On the first morning, I woke at 6, as I had every morning during 38 years in the profession, and carried my coffee onto the veranda. The sea in September was still warm, the morning light wide and golden across the water. No traffic from Philadelphia, only the sound of waves and seabirds. I sat there, drinking my coffee, thinking of Thomas, not with the sharp grief of the first years after his death, but with something gentler, the way you think of someone you have loved, and know that the love itself does not disappear, simply because the person is no longer present. "Thomas," I said to the sea, "I've come back to Cape May." My work in Cape May was not retirement in the conventional sense. I began writing the book I had long carried in my mind, not specifically about Eleanor's letters. That collection now belongs to the American Philosophical Society, and their own scholars will study it, but about the broader story, the private historical collections of ordinary families, and what becomes of them across generations. 38 years as an archivist have given me enough stories for such a book, about materials preserved because someone understood their value, and materials lost because no one did, about luck and carelessness and the thin line between history recorded and history erased. I also began truly operating the Eleanor Hartwell Historical Preservation Fund, not merely on paper, but in practice. In the first month, I funded 3 modest projects: an African-American family in Philadelphia seeking to preserve and digitize letters and photographs from their post-Civil War ancestors, a small church in Camden needing assistance conserving 19th century records, and a group of students from Temple University researching the history of the Italian immigrant community in South Philadelphia. Not grand projects, not founding fathers. Simply the ordinary stories of ordinary people whom history often overlooks. But Eleanor taught me that ordinary stories matter. The Hartwells were not nobility. They were merchants, ordinary citizens. Yet because they kept the letters, and because Eleanor kept them, and because I kept them, we now understand a small additional piece of how people lived and wrote and thought in the 18th century. Every family has a story. Every story deserves to be kept. In November, the American Philosophical Society opened the Eleanor Hartwell Collection Room. I was invited to the opening, not as a donor, but as the person who had preserved the collection and could tell its story. I wore the navy dress Thomas used to say suited me best, and drove from Cape May to Philadelphia alone. inside the gallery, so the letters rested in specially designed display cases with carefully controlled lighting, bright enough to read, but gentle enough to protect the ink and paper. Eliza Hartwell's journal lay beside them, open to the page describing the dinner at which she had sat next to Franklin, and on the wall a small bronze plaque, Eleanor Hartwell Collection Room. This collection was preserved by the Hartwell family of Philadelphia across generations from the Revolutionary era, safeguarded throughout the lifetime of Eleanor Grace Hartwell, 1892 to 1988, and entrusted to the American Philosophical Society by Adele Margaret Whitmore in 2023, with the condition that its story be told. This collection stands as evidence that history belongs not only to the famous, but to all who have lived and recorded their lives. I stood before that plaque for nearly 5 minutes without speaking, thinking of Eleanor, of Thomas, of the evening in 1988 when I sat on my study floor and opened the wooden box for the first time. This morning, February 2024, 5 months after moving to Cape May, I sit on the veranda with a cup of coffee, looking out at the Atlantic in the cold air of a New Jersey winter. Winter sea is not summer sea. No swimmers, no bright umbrellas, no children's laughter, only waves and gray sky and gulls riding the wind. Beautiful in the way things are beautiful when they make no effort to be. I am 66 years old, former head of special collections at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, founder of the Eleanor Hartwell Historical Preservation Fund, and now a woman writing a book about the history hidden in dusty boxes belonging to ordinary families. People sometimes ask me, when I tell Eleanor's story, whether I regret anything, what I did or failed to do, the decisions I made or delayed. My answer is always yes and no. Yes, I regret that I waited 30 years. Eleanor gave me the letters with the instruction to use them properly, and for 30 years I preserved them perfectly, but did not act. Not because I did not know what could be done, but because I lacked the courage to release something I cherished. That is a form of selfishness I must acknowledge. No, I do not regret how things ultimately unfolded. The letters now rest in the gallery of the American Philosophical Society, cared for by experts, accessible to the public, their story told in the way Eleanor intended. I cannot imagine a more fitting outcome. As for Jennifer and the sidewalk incident, I do not regret what I did afterward. Not because I wished to win nor to punish, but because 38 years in archives taught me that important things do not defend themselves. Those who understand their value must defend them. That is true of historical documents, and I learned it is also true of human dignity. Archival work taught me many technical skills: how to preserve ink and paper, how to decipher 18th century handwriting, how to connect seemingly unrelated documents. But the most important lesson was not technical. It was philosophical. History exists not because it preserves itself. It exists because someone recognizes its value and chooses to protect it. Sometimes that person is a renowned scholar with abundant resources. More often, it is someone ordinary, like Eleanor Hartwell, a 93-year-old woman in a small apartment near Rittenhouse Square, who simply understood that what she held mattered and did not wish it to disappear. I think of Jennifer and her remark that a house is not a storage unit for junk. She was not wrong in the literal sense. A house is not a storage unit. But she did not know that what filled those 7 boxes was not junk. Not because she lacked intelligence. She is intelligent. But because no one had taught her that a yellowed sheet of paper in a dusty box can be a bridge between us and those who laid the foundations of this country. That is what historical education should do, not merely teach dates and names, but teach people to recognize meaning in ordinary objects, to understand that history is not distant or abstract, but alive in letters and journals people are tempted to discard. The Eleanor Hartwell Fund works in that spirit, supporting modest preservation efforts for ordinary families, ordinary stories, ordinary people. Not because I expect we will uncover more letters from founding fathers, though I would not dismiss the possibility, but because each family's story deserves telling, and together those stories create a fuller picture of who we were and who we are. Thomas used to tell me, Adele, history isn't what happens to special people. It's the sum of what happens to everyone. He learned that from my father, 2 men who loved history and taught me how to see. I look out at the February sea and sip my coffee and think how fortunate I have been. Not because of letters or a house in Cape May or anything measurable, but because I have spent my life doing work I believed mattered, alongside people I loved. And when that April morning came, when Jennifer placed 7 boxes on the sidewalk, I knew exactly what to do. 38 years were not wasted. They prepared me for that moment, and that moment gave me everything that followed. The waves of Cape May rise and fall, steady and endless, as they have for thousands of years before I was born, and will continue after I am gone. History is larger than any of us, yet each of us is part of it, however small, however unknown, however absent from museums. Eleanor Hartwell had no fame. She was simply an elderly woman in a small apartment. But because she kept a small wooden box and knew to place it in the right hands, American history is richer by a small measure. That is enough to live for. I remain a while longer on the veranda, letting the coffee grow cool, watching the gulls wheel in the wind. There is one thing I have not mentioned, small, but important to me in its own way. On the day the Eleanor Hartwell Collection Room opened at the American Philosophical Society, after the guests had left and only Dr. Hartley and I remained in the gallery, I took out my phone and photographed the bronze plaque. Not to post on social media, not to send to anyone, simply to keep for myself. Then I stood before the final letter in the collection, a letter from Franklin to a merchant friend in Philadelphia in the summer of 1782, discussing the difficulties of building a new nation, the handwriting small and clear beneath controlled light, iron gall ink, 240 years old. I thought of Eleanor holding that letter years ago in her small apartment near Rittenhouse Square, knowing it mattered yet unsure what to do with it. I thought of Eliza Hartwell, an 18th century woman we know little about beyond her journal pages, sitting beside Franklin at dinner, recording his words with the seriousness of someone who understood. She was witnessing history. And I thought of all those in between, the generations of the Hartwell family passing the box from hand to hand, not fully knowing what lay inside, but knowing enough not to throw it away. That is how history is made, not only by the heroes in textbooks, but by millions of small decisions made by ordinary people. Keep this, discard that, Entrust this to someone else. Each right decision in that chain, each time someone chooses to preserve rather than discard, is a small victory of memory over forgetting. I am 66 years old, and I have been part of that chain. Not the most important link. Eleanor mattered more. Eliza Hartwell mattered more. But I did my part. And now I sit on the veranda of my house in Cape May, looking out at the Atlantic Ocean, ready for whatever comes next. I cannot tell this story without telling it alongside Thomas Edward Whitmore, the man I loved for 35 years and lost in the winter of 2010, when neither of us was prepared, though no one is ever truly prepared for such things. Thomas was born in 1954 in Baltimore and came to Philadelphia to study law at Temple University. I met him in 1975 at a lecture on historic preservation law. He sat in the front row, I in the back. And when the speaker posed a question about private property rights versus the public interest in heritage conservation, we both raised our hands at the same time. Our answers were different. He stood on the side of private rights. I stood on the side of public interest. We argued the way two young people argue when they have just met, and both believe they are right, fiercely and brilliantly, neither willing to concede. After the lecture, Thomas came up to me and said, "You're wrong, but you argue well." I replied, "You're right about that. I am wrong. Would you like some coffee?" And we drank coffee for 3 hours at a small cafe on Walnut Street. Thomas became an attorney specializing in real estate and preservation law, work that paired perfectly with mine. We used to joke that we came to the same cause from opposite sides. He made important things legally protected. I made sure they were physically preserved. Thomas knew about Eleanor's collection from the beginning. I told him the very first night I opened the box. He sat beside me on the study floor for nearly 2 hours, reading each letter carefully. When he finished, he looked at me and said something I have remembered for 35 years. "Adele, these don't belong to you, not in the legal sense. Legally, they're yours, but in the sense that you are holding history in trust. That means you have a responsibility, not just a right." "A responsibility to do what?" I asked. "A responsibility to make sure they reach the right place at the right time," he said. "You'll know when that time comes." For 35 years, we lived together in the Spruce Street townhouse. The working years, the years of raising Marcus, the summers spent returning to Cape May, the years of growing older and realizing that morning coffee together on the veranda was the most precious thing we had. Thomas never pushed me to decide what to do with the letters. He understood that I needed to arrive at that decision in my own way. He died on December 7th, 2010, of a stroke, quick and painless, and the doctor said he never knew he was leaving. That comforted me in a certain way, though it did not lessen the reality that on that morning I lost the person with whom I had shared everything for 35 years. In the first months after Thomas died, I rarely entered the study. The safe with the letters remained there, locked tight. Sometimes I would stand before it and think of what Thomas had said. "You'll know when that time comes." And when Jennifer threw the 7 boxes onto the curb on April 11th, 2023, I knew that was the time. Not because Jennifer was the reason or the catalyst, but because that moment clarified something I had long understood, yet had not acted upon. Important things must be placed where they belong before the opportunity is gone. Thomas did not live to see what I ultimately did with Eleanor's letters, but he taught me enough that I knew how to do it properly when the time came. That is Thomas's true legacy to me, not the house, not the money, not anything measurable, but the way he taught me to think about responsibility, timing, and the courage to act once one has thought long enough. On that first morning in Cape May, when I carried my coffee onto the veranda and said, "Thomas, I'm back in Cape May," I was not speaking into empty air. I was speaking to the man who had stood beside me through 35 years, and who continues to stand beside me in the way those we love never truly leave. In October 2023, 3 months after I moved back to Cape May, Marcus called to tell me that he and Jennifer had decided to separate. I heard the news sitting on the Cape May veranda on an autumn afternoon, watching the ocean shift color in the sunset light. "That decision belongs to the two of you," I said. "I love you. I also care about Jennifer. But your marriage is not mine to decide." "Aren't you sad?" Marcus asked. "I'm sad that you're going through this," I answered honestly. "Not sad about a specific outcome." After we hung up, I sat alone with my thoughts. I was not pleased about their separation, nor was I devastated. What I felt was more complicated, an acceptance that comes from understanding that family relationships are complex and do not always conclude in ways outsiders would prefer. What I knew for certain was that I did not want the events of April to become something anyone, including myself, would use as justification or evidence in future conflicts. What happened, happened. I acted in the way I believed was right. Now life moves forward. In November, Marcus came to Cape May to visit me for the first time. He stayed 3 days. We walked along the shore, ate fresh seafood at a small restaurant Thomas and I used to frequent, and spoke about things we had not had space to speak about for many years. One afternoon, sitting on the veranda with coffee, Marcus said, "Mom, could you tell me more about the letters? Not about the history, but about Eleanor and about Dad and about how you decided." And so I told him, not the summary version I had given on May 3rd, but the full account. From my first interview with Eleanor in 1985 to the night I sat on the study floor and opened the wooden box, from 30 years of preservation to the day I stood in the Eleanor Hartwell collection room and looked at the letters for the last time. Marcus listened in silence. When I finished, he sat with his coffee gone cold in his hands and stared out at the ocean. "You carried that weight alone for 30 years, he said at last. "Not entirely alone," I replied. "Your father knew. He was beside me." "Do you miss him?" "Every day," I said, "but not in a painful way anymore, in the way someone carries the memory of the person they love like light. It's there, not heavy, just luminous." Marcus nodded slowly. "Mom, I want to understand your work better. Not to do it. I don't have the gift for it, but because I think I never understood why it mattered so much to you." "Where would you like to start?" I asked. "Could you take me to the American Philosophical Society, to that gallery?" "When would you like to go?" "Tomorrow?" The next day, I drove with Marcus from Cape May to Philadelphia. We arrived at the American Philosophical Society on Chestnut Street, and I led him into the Eleanor Hartwell collection room. Marcus stood before the glass case, holding the letters for a long time without speaking. Then he read the brass plaque on the wall, the story from the Hartwell family, to Eleanor, to me. "Mom," he said quietly, "this is the first time I truly understand what you did." I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the most accurate answer. On the drive back to Cape May, Marcus asked about the Eleanor Hartwell Fund and the projects it supports. I told him about the African American family preserving post-Civil War letters, the church in Camden safeguarding 19th century records, the Temple students researching Italian immigrant communities. "Do you need help?" Marcus asked, "with the legal side of the fund, paperwork?" I looked at my son, 39 years old, trying to reconnect with his mother and with what matters. And I thought of Thomas. What would he say now? He would say, "Let him." "Thank you," I said. "I'll call you." On the way back to Cape May, I stopped at a small gas station in the flatlands of New Jersey, bought a paper cup of ordinary coffee, the kind you drink while driving, expecting nothing special, and sat in the car looking out at harvested cornfields, our dry stalks standing in the dusk. I thought about everything that had happened in the past year, from the morning of April 11th to this November afternoon, from Dorothy's phone call to this quiet moment alone in my car on the road home to Cape May. Not everything ended the way I would have chosen. Marcus and Jennifer separated. I would not have wished that for my son. My relationship with Marcus is being rebuilt from the ground up, slowly and honestly. Not in the superficial way of mother and son performing closeness, but in the way two adults learn to truly see one another. But Eleanor's letters are where they belong. The Eleanor Hartwell Fund is doing small things I believe are right. And I am living according to what I believe, not according to what others expect of me. That is what I can do. That is enough. History does not preserve itself. It requires people who are not discouraged when no one believes in what they are doing. It requires people willing to keep a wooden box for 30 years because they know it matters. It requires people who understand that a yellowed sheet of paper in a dusty box may contain the spirit of an entire generation, and who are willing to protect it even when no one believes them. I was that person for Eleanor's letters, and the Eleanor Hartwell Fund now supports others so they may be that person for their own family stories. No one remembers the archivist's name. That is the nature of this profession. You do your work so well that no one notices you did it. But history remains, and that is the only reward this work requires. 38 years, one small wooden box, 27 letters, and an elderly woman named Eleanor Hartwell who trusted the right person. I sat in my car beside a harvested New Jersey field, drinking cold paper cup coffee, and for the first time in many years felt that I had completed what I had been entrusted to do. Not completed in the sense of finished. The Eleanor Hartwell Fund is just beginning its work. The book I am writing is not yet done, and Marcus and I are still rebuilding our relationship day by day. Completed in the sense that an important chapter has been properly closed. I started the car and drove on toward Cape May. The ocean was waiting.